Hi, it's Dr. Robert Guthrie. We're back again and we're working our way through our church history lessons. Now, um, we're not trying to do this like this is a college course. You could do a college course, half of the semester would cover this lesson and the next lesson we're going to do. Um, that's not our point here. Our point is to give you all a taste, because most modern day Protestants, any Christians, really don't have much background in this type of church history unless you study it. So it's to give you all a taste of what was going on and how these things evolved, because churches always evolve to where we are now. So this time we're covering the early church, and most people don't think about it, but they realize that when Jesus came back from his resurrection and then in the different accounts went up on the mountain and left, he really didn't leave behind any organization or administrative structure. He said, go to all the nations of the world, make believers of all nations, and I'll see you guys, and off he went. So they really started from scratch. And a lot of it's not known. We do have some histories available. I've got probably the most comprehensive one right here. This is Archbishop Eusebius's Christian history, but he didn't have a lot of good sources for it, and I've got a variety of the other texts. But most of these this writing doesn't appear till 150, 200, and a lot of that is more arguments about what resurrection means and what faith is, etc. So the period we're diving into right now, we really don't know a whole lot. And the Christian movement, which starts in the Roman Empire, by the mid 300s has taken over the Roman Empire. It's a very interesting story, but it starts with Paul's journeys, because the original Christian group in Jerusalem were more Jewish Christians, even though they were true Christians, and they really weren't trying to reach out to the non-Jewish world. And Paul comes along and he says, hey, we're going to go out and try to reach everybody, which is what Jesus told him to do. So we're going to go and approach the Gentile world also. Now, we know what he did. He would go from city to city along the Eastern Mediterranean and build up a contingent of followers in a church or churches, and he'd move on, he'd come back, and he'd write letters back and forth, and he ended up going to Jerusalem a couple times. He finally ended up in Rome, where he was apparently, excuse me, I got the itchy eyes here, apparently executed during the time of Nero in 64 AD, about the same time Peter was crucified. That's the standard knowledge, which is in things like Eusebius's text. But Jesus didn't leave behind an administrative structure. Now, Paul basically started what were really urban churches, and a lot of his followers were probably not the bottom tread of society. They were the middle or the upper middle of society. One of his converts was a man named Erastus, who was the city treasurer of the city of Corinth in Greece. He had another one, Priscilla and Aquila, and she was a merchant of purple goods, which are luxury, very expensive luxury goods, like something you make stoles now or something. So his group encompassed several layers of society, but they're really in the organization. In the first century, what little we know about the church, it appears that these were mainly conducted kind of cooperatively and locally. That they would meet in individual homes. Whoever had the largest home would usually host the church, and they would meet before sunrise, and they would share a meal together, and they'd sing some hymns and say some prayers. And it was very low-key, and they weren't trying to draw the attention of the Roman authorities. If you're a Christian in an area like China, where the authorities are not supportive, you lie low. And in general, the Romans were pretty tolerant in the first century. They regarded Judaism as a strange but old and tolerated religion, and Christians were originally thought to be a sect of Judaism, which is where it evolved from. So they didn't really bother the Christians in the first century. And the churches slowly expanded in ways we're not exactly certain, probably in various urban areas, and maybe as more and more people got converted, they had different homes they would meet in, even in Corinth or Ephesus or other places. They would have several churches in the city. In the early part of the second century, 105, 110, in what's now Western Turkey, there was one effort to pick on the Christians somewhat, and this came from a guy named Pliny the Younger, and he was appointed governor, and some of the other locals would come and complain about the Christians because they were cutting into the business. If you were a person who made idols for worship in the temple, or you collected revenues from the donations in the temple or other things like that, the Christians wouldn't go harass you, but they would just stop coming. They wouldn't come to the temple functions. They wouldn't come to buy your idols. They would quietly stay to themselves. They started complaining about the Christians. So he examined them, and if they were Christians, he would capital punishment. And he writes his friend, the emperor, and said, "Did I do okay?" And the emperor says, "Sounds okay to me, but don't go looking for it." He said, and Pliny had said, they meet before sunrise, they're law abiding, they don't make any trouble, they sing hymns and eat a meal together, and they go about their business. And the emperor says, well, that's okay, but don't go looking for these people. It's a very interesting statement, because in general, the Christians could stay beneath the radar by doing the things they were supposed to do. They were supposed to be good. They were supposed to be law-abiding. They were supposed to be respectful, supposed to love each other and love their neighbors, and not make violence and other things like that. And so they were actually model citizens who had a different belief system. So for a long time, they could stay beneath the radar of the Roman Empire. Like I said, in the first century, it was primarily home churches from what we presume. We just don't know. They probably weren't building church buildings. They didn't have enough members. They didn't have enough money. They didn't want to draw attention to themselves that much. By the second century, some kind of organizational structure was beginning to emerge. You begin to see writings from some of the church fathers. I got some of them here. There was a man named Irenaeus in southeast France, and he wrote a wide variety of discussion things, not history, but tracts saying about this and tracts about that. What does the resurrection mean, et cetera, et cetera. And so he writes about 180. So we're starting to see official writings scattered through the empire in the late second century. The second century is a time of a fair amount of turmoil and a time of challenge, because as the church started to spread, you had a variety of things that threatened it. One was heretical figures inside the church. In any kind of church structure, there's always somebody who thinks they know better than everybody else, and they're going to tell everybody else how to do it. That's because I've got a special vision and this and that. And these people are always showing up, and they're pushing their own ego needs more than the message, and they fade away or die off, and that movement disappears. He had a variety of those. Eusebius records a bunch of them here in his history, which I won't go into. The other thing that came, so you had a bunch of heresies inside the church, and time and adherence to proper belief took care of them. They would fade their own way because there really wasn't any validity to them. Gnosticism was a completely different movement, and it tried to incorporate Jesus, and it was threatening to the church. It starts up, as far as we can tell, in the early second century, 110, 120. There's a man named Valentinus who had a Gnostic church in Rome about 140. And it's difficult to explain because I don't completely understand it. I'm not certain anybody really does, because it disappeared after about 150 years. So we just have a scattering of writings about it. And it appears to have layers of spirituality. There's a good God and a bad God, and a series of bad gods, and a bad heaven and a good heaven, and these spirit worlds, layers of spirits, and they would come down and assume form and be seen. And they tried to incorporate Jesus into this, saying he was basically a spiritual presence when he was here on earth. And they're trying to capitalize on the popularity of Jesus at this time, because the word is spreading 100 years later after the resurrection. So they try to incorporate it. Now, this is a threat theologically to the church, because if Jesus was just a spirit and not a human being, then he couldn't have suffered in agony on the cross, because spirits can't suffer agony on the cross. He had to be a human being to do that, and he had to die a human death and be resurrected. So it theologically was a threat also. And so you do find several, Irenaeus wrote things attacking it. and it fades away in the early 3rd century and disappears. And these kind of movements come up and disappear all the time. In 1945, in Egypt, down the Nile, south of Cairo, a place called Nag Hammadi, this guy's out digging up bird droppings for fertilizer, and he finds a large jar like this, like the jars from the Dead Sea Scrolls, with a bunch of books in it. And these are the Nag Hammadi texts, and they were books, and these were books written from a Gnostic church of some kind, a Gnostic point of view. And so everybody gets all excited because it's a very ancient text. And this was discovered prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls, about 3 years prior, so it was the most ancient text we had. And there's a lot of hoopla about this. The Gospel according to Thomas, a full copy of it was in Nag Hammadi. The church fathers knew about the Gospel of Thomas, and they said, blah, And it got a lot of press about 20 years ago when the group called the Jesus Seminar, a bunch of professors, got together and they decided what was legitimate in the scripture and what wasn't, because they were basically trying to make Jesus act like them, to be a professor. Jesus was not a professor. I'm a professor. He was not a professor. He was very different. And they gave it a lot of play. Well, I've got a copy of it here, and I'll show you. And some of the sayings are, and it's all sayings. There's no history, there's no birth narrative, there's no death narrative, there's no resurrection. It's all just sayings. And some of these sayings are typical Christian things, almost right out of the scriptures, and some are so weird that I can't imagine why anybody cares about it. Here's one. Blessed is the lion which the man eats, and the lion will become man. And cursed is the man whom the lion eats, and the lion will become man. Now, you can explain that one to me? I'll be more than happy to listen, okay? Here's another one I found. And right after the ones, he has the one about the seeds falling on the thorns in the path, right out of the scriptures. And then I have Jesus saying, Jesus said, I cast fire upon the world, and I guard it until the world is a fire. The heavens shall pass away. I thought, well, the world's not a fire. The heavens shall pass away, and above it shall pass away, and the dead are not alive, and the living shall not die. In the days when you devoured the dead, you made it alive. When you came into light, what will you do? I mean, if you want to explain that one to me, I'm open to hear that one also. And finally, Jesus said, if you fast, you will create sin for yourself, and if you pray, you will be condemned. And if you give alms, you will do evil to your spirits. And if you go in the land and wander in the regions, if they receive you, eat what they set before you, heal the sick bone. For what goes into your mouth will not defile you. So anyway, so there it is. If you want to read Gospel of Thomas, let me know. I'll run a copy for you and send it to you, but I wouldn't bother. So anyway, Gnosticism fades out from its own weakness, and many of these other individual movements inside Christianity fade away over time also. We've had lots of them come and lots of them go. And so fortunately, this one fades out, and it kind of folded up by the mid-3rd century. And like I said, details of the history aren't clear, and there's the Gospel of Thomas. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, prominent Christian areas, theologians were writing about Christianity, and several of them were mentioned. We mentioned Irenaeus, he's in this one. Clement of Alexandria, one of the great early scholars. That's Alexandria in Egypt, he's in that one. One of the great early scholars even later, and one of his pupils was named Origen. And you find a lot of the theological discussion coming out of these people, because many of the issues that are important in our lives are not covered in the New Testament. There's a lot of things that aren't covered in the New Testament. People will be surprised when we discuss it again, how many things are not there. But they discuss things like Jesus' divinity, Jesus' resurrection, our own death and resurrection, what scriptures are. Last week we talked about the various comments these people had on what books were going to be scriptural and which weren't, and they pretty much predicted what we ended up with. And so these are early resources. Then we don't know if we have all the writings, but we have a big chunk, and we can look at it. But during this 3rd century, the church begins to organize, and it organizes. There's still no national church. Remember, the empire, or this is growing on for the most part, is still pagan, officially pagan. So they're starting to organize themselves locally, and 2 terms have appeared from really the early 2nd century on. Presbyter, which basically translates to priest. So this person would either be equivalent of a United Methodist minister, a Catholic priest, person who works locally in a church to minister to the flock there. And episkopos, which is a term that evolved over time. We're not certain exactly what it meant originally. Probably meant more like a head priest who had several other priests underneath him. But it became the meaning of the term bishop. And originally, the bishops had probably a large church or several small churches. And eventually, the bishops became regional authorities around cities: Antioch, Aleppo, Alexandria, later Constantinople, Rome. And the bishops became people of great significance because they administered churches often around large metropolitan areas. Christianity really grew in a great way from city to city. It became a rural movement feeding out from the cities, but it was really city to city. There was a very early Christian kingdom called Edessa, not Odessa, which is in Ukraine, but Edessa, which is up in northern Syria, southeast Turkey, became Christian about 206, early 3rd century, because the king converted. But in general, that was a rare and unusual one. You didn't have anything like that until at the end of this early church era, along comes Constantine. Constantine is Constantine the Great. He's a very interesting, fascinating person. In the early part of the 4th century, 310, 312, he was a claimant to the imperial throne. If you're familiar with Roman history, most of you aren't, and I wouldn't bother. After the Caesar Augustus in the first 100, in the 1st century and stuff, they had a series of people fighting to get to be emperor, civil wars around this person, civil wars around that person. Person would get in for a while, there'd be a couple successions, there'd be another civil war. And Constantine is one of the claimants at this time, and he's about to have a battle to resolve who's going to be emperor in this time of uncertainty. Remember, when you don't have an electoral system, you end up killing each other to take over power. It's a very human thing. So he's a claimant, and and this is in 312 AD, and he receives what he describes as the vision. I've read, there are like 4 different accounts of it. I've read 4 of them, and one of them seems it was really a dream. And in this dream/vision, he sees Jesus and he sees a Christian symbol, a cross, the version that they used in those days, descending on from heaven, and it says, "With this conquer." So he has his troops paint this cross from his vision/dream on their shields as they go into battle at the Danubian Bridge, and they win this big victory. And he becomes emperor. So he becomes a Christian after this episode. And there's a lot of discussion out there and a lot of nonsense. People have tried to say, well, he did this for political benefit. I think hogwash. Probably 15% of the empire was Christian at the time. He didn't do this for political benefit. There wasn't enough political benefit from becoming Christian in a predominantly pagan empire. And the variety of other things come along. And if you look at what happened between then and the Council of Nicaea in 325, it's clear he really believed this. Now, he's an interesting contrast in things because he was a Christian warlord. You think that's a conflict. Well, remember, there's a lot of these issues, these moral issues about violence and fighting and all these other things we struggle with now have not been discussed in the New Testament. Many of them have grown out of moral positions that evolved in the church after the New Testament was written. The New Testament doesn't cover lots of these controversial issues, which I'm not going to get into in detail here, but it's some of them that are really fighting now. It's not there. A lot of these started with St. Augustine in 400 and have gone on through our own evolution as Christians. So there's really nothing to say you can't, in the New Testament, that you can't be a Christian warlord. So I think he is. I think he's very sincere. Other people point out that he was baptized on his deathbed. Yeah. Was that unusual? No, not at that time. Baptism in those days was felt to wash away your sins. So what better time to wash away your sins than when you're dying? Makes sense, because we're all sinners all the time. And so it made sense in its own context at the time. Nowadays, baptism is regarded as a commitment, either from a teenager or adult who's becoming baptized as a competent person to make their own decisions, a commitment to be a Christian and to live a Christian life and support the church. And for parents with infant baptism, which started so far back that nobody really knows when it started. And I was baptized as an infant. We had our children baptized as infants. And that's a commitment on the part of the parents to raise the child in a Christian home. So that's all. So do these things make any difference? Do these things say that these people who said, oh, Constantine was just doing it for politics? I don't buy it. It's my personal opinion, and you can disagree with me. That's fine. But he remains a tremendously important figure in Christianity. He does not make the empire Christian. He lets people make their own decisions. However, he becomes very supportive of Christianity, and with the imperial patronage, he really gives Christianity a leg up, but it is not official. And even after him, a successor emperor tried to roll it back. And finally, by about 360, 365, about 30 years after his death, it becomes official. So it takes over the empire a little over 300 years after Jesus' death. So anyway, that's kind of the culmination of doing in 25 minutes what you could do in a college semester, showing that the evolution of the church. And there's a couple of interesting points. There was no structure left behind by Jesus. The Christians had to develop their own structure. There was no imperial church at the time. So everything ran locally. So the churches started, and they spread from home churches in cities to where they had multiple churches in the city. They appointed leadership for each individual church, the priest, the presbyter. They appointed the episcopos, the bishop, who administered a large number of churches, usually around a big city like Alexandria, Rome, Aleppo, Constantinople. We have a West Ohio bishop and an East Ohio bishop here in the United Methodist Church. So we still have bishops. Other churches don't. And eventually, it becomes the church of the emperor with the great support there. And within a little over 300 years, Christianity takes over the Roman Empire. An amazingly successful story for this small, rebellious Jewish sect in what's now the 30 era of the AD calendar, showing God's hand in this remarkable success in a church that went from tiny little group in Jerusalem, scared and hiding, to this empire-wide takeover and then worldwide spread. So I'm going to stop there. The next lesson will be dealing with Constantine as his imperial role in the Council of Nicaea, and the beginning of a series of questions of trying to define who was this person, Jesus of Nazareth. Who was he? And what was he in some different ways? So it's a point of great interest, both theologically and historically. I've been interested in this since I was in college. So we're going to stop here, and next lesson we're going to be doing the Council of Nicaea, which has Constantine and a lot of the issues called Arianism and other things like that. This is Dr. Guthrie. Been a pleasure.